Hey guys, welcome back to a page in the chapter, or welcome if you are new here. My name is Paige and today it is time for my January wrap up. Now I think this is probably going to be one of the shortest of my wrap ups because I read 5 books in the month of January, which on its own I'm quite happy with. That's a pretty standard number. I was ahead on my Goodreads goal at the time, it was all Gucci. The problem is that every book I read was part of a series. There's not a lot of individual books to talk about. I just have 2 series that I want to talk to you about, so it's probably going to be a slightly shorter wrap up. I'm also just not feeling 100% myself today. There's nothing actively wrong with me. I just don't feel myself. Do you ever have those vibes? I'm just very, very unmotivated. But we move. If you guys like seeing wrap-ups every single month and you want to see more, then make sure you hit that big red subscribe button down below to stay tuned for future content. I upload twice a week on a Wednesday and a Friday, so there is no shortage of bookish content here for you to enjoy. I post wrap-ups and TBRs every single month, and if you are interested in knowing more about what I'm reading and how I'm reviewing it in real time, then do feel free to check me out on Instagram and Twitter at Page and Chapter, so you don't have to keep waiting a whole month, because that's a long time to wait. Except in February, obviously, because only 28 days. And with that, let's just get on into the books that I read, because I don't really want to mess around too much today. So I did not start reading on the first day of the year or anything like that. I really took my time choosing what my first book of 2022 was going to be, and I think we started off strong. I started 2022 off with These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong, and I am delighted to tell you that I did give it 5 stars. I loved it. So if you are unaware, These Violent Delights is a Romeo and Juliet retelling centered around Roma and Juliet in 1920 Shanghai, and they're from rival gangs who kind of kill each other on sight, except Roma and Juliet have to team up to chase down a monster that is attacking gang members of both affiliations in Shanghai, and this journey really takes them into the heart of politics and socio-political history in Shanghai, and this was just dealt with in such a stunning way. Oh my god, the fact that the politics and the history is so deeply entwined in this book is absolutely incredible. I love fantasy romance in general, and the romance in this was top notch, but I think what makes this book so good is the historical fantasy elements of it. Romeo and Juliet, yes, are very cute, but if it had just been that, I don't think I would have liked this book as much. They were very, very fun to read about, but was I really fangirling that much over them? I wasn't too engaged in their love story, but the monster they were chasing down and how it linked to politics, that I was super interested in, and Chloe Gong delivered beautifully. The romance in this book is also an enemies to lovers, so if that's not a big selling point of this book, I don't know what is. And I can be iffy on enemies to lovers sometimes. I do love it as a concept, but I think sometimes they can be a bit too unbelievable. If I were to tell you outright what these two characters had done to each other, you would be yeah, they're two strong enemies to ever be lovers. But again, because of how the politics and the history and the whole gang war thing is so deeply intertwined with this story, it makes the enemies to lovers work really, really well. You can really, really believe how Roma and Juliet can hate each other so strongly, but also kind of forgive each other and continue to work in the right direction. And I just loved everything about this book. I'm so happy I gave it 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. I was freaking out over this book, and before I'd even finished it, I was on the last 20 pages or so. I went to Foyles and I managed to track down the second book, and I got the last one that they had in the whole store. But I knew that I had to binge read this duology. I had to. So then naturally the next book that I read was Our Violent Ends by Chloe Gong. Now the fact that I have the hardback of this and the paperback of this really bugs me. I will be purchasing a hard copy in These Violent Delights just so they match. Chloe Gong, take all my money. So this pretty much follows on directly from These Violent Delights. I think the book starts about 6 months after the end of the last book, and I really don't want to spoil anything, so I can't exactly give you a synopsis of this book. It was a really, really good continuation. I did like it slightly less than These Violent Delights, but I still gave it 5 stars. It was still incredible, and it was still a 5-star book, but if you were to you know, gun to my head, make me choose which one I preferred, I did prefer these Violent Delights. So the romance is a little bit stronger in this book. However, the politics and all that still very much plays a role. Shanghai is in a bit more of a chaotic situation in this book than it was in these Violent Delights. The politics is even stronger. And what I kind of liked about this book is that it kind of takes the story down a very different path than you originally see it going. You kind of get to the end of this book and you have a little bit of a like, what happened to the original plot of the movie type of situation, but like in a good way. It's like how kind of when you get to the end of Harry Potter and you're like, wow, very gradually this series like really changed, and Chloe Gong has kind of managed to give you that feeling in just 2 books of like a lot more time passing than it has, and like you've been in this world for a lot longer than you have. And then the ending of this book is just incredible. It was such a good ending. I think she wrapped it up really well. If you haven't read this one yet, highly recommend. It really is just as enjoyable as the first one, and I actually do recommend binge reading them because there's only 2 and they kind of flow on from each other in terms of time span quite quickly. They work very well as a binge read, so very happy to have got this duology on and off my TBR straight away. So the next series that I decided to pick up is the Hades and Persephone series by Scarlett St. Clair. I will talk about these books individually. I know usually if it's a series I talk about it all together, but for the sake of this video being longer than 5 minutes, I'll talk about them separately. So A Touch of Darkness is the first book, and it takes place in a world where the Greek gods are still the Greek gods with their powers and everything, but they exist more as celebrities in this new Athens world rather than as actual gods. Like they come down to earth and they do like meet and greets, and people can go and like actually meet the gods and pray to them, and like Olympus still exists, but the gods are also very much like in society as these celebrities. So Persephone is hiding her identity as a goddess because Demeter has told her that it will not be safe, and Demeter wants to keep her hidden, and Persephone very much just wants to go to university and be a journalist and just make a name for herself as a journalist. She's not interested in really being a god at all. Whilst interning at New Athens News, I think it's called, she decides that she's going to do a bit of an expose on Hades because she thinks that he is one of the worst gods and he does all these dodgy deals and he's purposely trying to trick humans into giving away their souls so he can keep them in the underworld. So she does a bit of an expose on him, and this kind of leads to her accidentally being trapped in one of Hades' deals herself. It's a fantasy romance, but very heavy on the romance. Like, it's a romance set in a fantasy world, basically. You can kind of guess what happened. It's very smutty, but this was my favourite of the 3 books. I didn't really like the world building, and in terms of how it's not written fantastically. I saw recently that Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction DNF'd this book because it's very telly. Like, it tells you that there's tension between Hades and Persephone, it doesn't show you. It tells you everything about the world, it doesn't show you. There's a lot of like plot holes in this book. Also, one of the most absolutely infuriating things about this book that really pissed me off is that the chapter headings are in Roman numerals and it's a fucking Greek book. That really pissed me off, I won't lie. So things about this book are, you know, not fantastic. However, as you guys probably know, I do rate based on enjoyment, and I gave this book a 4 stars because by about the 150 page mark, I went on to Waterstones and I purchased the next 2 books for next day delivery. I don't know if it was just exactly what I was in the mood for. Whilst pretty much everything about this book wasn't that well written, the tension and the romance between the characters after about the 150 page point I really enjoyed. I also didn't like that it was just like pure smut like constantly thrown at you. Scarlett St. Clair kind of like does draw it out and really make you work for it. It was very well written smut. Like this woman may not be able to build a world, but she can build a smut scene. Yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I got to the end of this book and I literally couldn't pick up anything else. I had to wait for the next book to arrive. If you pick this up based on my 4-star rating, please know that objectively it is not a 4-star book, and don't hate me if you decide to read it because I was just here for the good old smutty goodness and not really for the world building. But yeah, I personally really enjoyed this book. And so then we have A Touch of Ruin. This was my least favourite of the 3 that I read. I think I gave this one 3.5 stars, but looking back I would probably give it a 3. As I've mentioned, my favourite part of the first book was the smut, and there's really not a lot of smut in this book. I will say I do find Persephone to be quite a relatable character. A lot of the things that she gets insecure about in her relationship with Hades don't come up in books a lot, and I think because everyone would be the first to jump on it and go, oh, the character's so immature, oh, the character is so toxic. I don't know what that says about me, but I found them to be quite relatable things. So I did find the things that they were arguing about and were causing tension in their relationship, I did find those to be very believable and relatable. But this book was just very much a filler book, and I think the reason that is I'm not entirely sure that this book was supposed to be a series. Like, things at the end of A Touch of Darkness weren't entirely wrapped up, but it felt like it had a very solid ending. And the world building in the first book was just not good enough to carry a 4-book series. But in this book, it really stripped it all back, kind of took the romance away and really worked on some of this world building, especially in terms of the gods and the systems between the gods and the relationships between the gods. It felt like this book kind of had to go back to basics and really fix some of the errors that were in the first book, because by this point the publisher and our author was aware that there were going to be 2 other books at least. I really don't know what the situation with this book or this series was, but it did just really feel like this book kind of just took it back to basics, which did set it up for the next few books to be better, but it did make reading this one not nearly as an enjoyable experience, but I really wanted to like it, so I think my star rating was a little bit high just based on how badly I wanted to like it. And so then we have A Touch of Malice, and this book kind of pissed me off because I really thought that this was the end of a series. I thought this was a trilogy, but it is not. There is a 4th book called A Touch of Chaos that is not out yet, and this book ended on a massive fucking cliffhanger! Why? Why do they do this to me? So I feel like as a fantasy book, this book was the strongest and the most complex of all of them in terms of the fantasy. The romance in this started to irritate me. I do feel like some things were brought in at the end that I was like, oh, that makes it interesting. I'm really intrigued to see what she's going to do with that little twist. Things were brought in to make the romance a little bit interesting, but it was pretty much every chapter or every other chapter they were doing it in this book, and I get it. He's Hades, she's Persephone, they're gods, they're just doing it. But it did get a little repetitive and boring. I do feel like there are, other things that they could have explored in their sex life that would have at least made each sex scene a little bit different to read, but they didn't. It was just kind of the same thing over and over again. This book does have triggers and content warnings for sexual assault, so please still steer clear of this book. That's going to be a trigger for you. I would actually say if it's going to be a trigger for you, I would steer clear of A Touch of Ruin. At the end of A Touch of Ruin, it's kind of touched on a little bit, and then the consequences of that event are really, really explored in this book, especially as well because it's a Greek myth retelling, and the Greek myths, you can't read the Greek myths without reading about one of the gods taking advantage of a woman in some way. So yeah, this book did deal with that and touch on that quite a lot, so I would steer clear of it. However, as a fantasy, I do feel like this book was quite solid. Better than A Touch of Ruin. To me, not as enjoyable as A Touch of Darkness though. Somewhere in between the two. I think this one would have probably been the better 3.5 stars. I'm hoping Touch of Chaos is the 4th and last book. I'm very interested to see how it all wraps up and whether this momentum of the world of the fantasy that she's created keeps going. Because when I was reading this book, it was the first time in the 3 books where I was like, okay, this is actually a fantasy, go off sis. This is actually a solid fantasy. So whilst I didn't, necessarily go into these books expecting a real fantasy, I came out with one. So I also came out with another series on my TBR, but it's genuinely not my fault this time. If you want something a bit more fun, that's a bit more Rick Riordan, but make it adult, then I do think this series could be for you, especially if you want a smutty Greek romance. Then I do really, really recommend these books. Just know that they objectively, and especially the first book, is really not fantastic. It does have its flaws, and you really just have to push through those flaws, and hopefully you will enjoy it as much as I do if you do decide that you want to give it a go. So yeah, here are the 5 books that I read in the month of January. You can see now why I said that they'd be a little difficult to talk about, because they're not individual books. I was like binge reading series pretty much. So yeah, it was a pretty solid month of reading. It was not my best reading month, but I did really enjoy all of the books that I was reading, so in that sense it was. And this is like my big goal for 2022. Even if I'm only reading 5 books, but I was able to take the time to really enjoy them and give them high ratings, then isn't that better than reading like 10 books like I used to, but I would hate half of them? Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do really hope that you enjoyed. If you did enjoy and you want to see more, then do feel free to hit that big red subscribe button down below. We are so close to 600 subscribers, which is just such a shocking number. Also, as I mentioned, you can check me out on my other social medias if you want to see pictures of books or pictures of my dogs or updates on what I'm reading, how I'm reviewing it. Then it is at Page and Chapter on Instagram and Twitter. I hope you guys are having a fantastic week, you are enjoying everything you are reading, and there are no reading slumps in your future. And I will see you next week for my next video. Bye guys.